Hello there, everyone, and welcome to Veeam Live. We're here today to talk about Kubernetes best practices and also Kasten by Veeam. So I'm David Hill. I'm a global technologist in the product strategy group at Veeam, and I'm joined by my colleague Vaibhav. Vaibhav, a few welcome words, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dave. And thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Vaibhav. I'm the CTO here now at the new Kubernetes business unit at Veeam.
Yeah, really exciting times at Veeam today with everything going on. So the first thing I kind of want to talk about is where we're actually at with Kubernetes and what we're seeing in the real world. And essentially what we're seeing is a lot of interesting aspects around stateful containers. When containers were originally launched, the idea was that they'd be stateless, just easily destroyable, spin them up, scale them out, and then kill them when you needed. But the way that enterprises now are actually leveraging Kubernetes is to actually start leveraging these in a stateful manner. So whether that's the application is storing data within a container, or it has some persistent state configurations like session configurations and IDs and things like that, we're finding that around about the top 10 containers running in Kubernetes platforms now, about 50% of those are all stateful. So that's proving a challenge when we're looking at how we can actually protect these applications and workloads out in the real world. They may be scalable and secure, but being able to protect that data is always at the forefront of everybody's mind, especially nowadays when we hear so much about ransomware, which you've probably heard quite a lot about throughout this Veeam Live sessions already. Next slide, please, Vaibhav. You can tell it's a live session. So as we are live, and this is working really well, what we'll do is we'll talk about the actual architecture and the 5 Kubernetes best practices. So when we look at essentially the best architecture around this, applications in the Kubernetes and containers world are the operational unit. So you'll notice here a diagram on the left is essentially showing you what makes up all these different container environments. So when we look at the application, what we'll see here is you can see things like we've got a number of pods. Well, pods are the containers themselves in a Kubernetes world. But then what makes up this application is things like configuration maps, things like the stateful sets, the secrets, different services as well, whether that be external databases or anything like that. So it's very important that when you're looking to actually protect these workloads, that you're able to actually understand what makes up an application. When we think about virtualization and how we always protect our virtual machines, the virtual machine is the boundary. So it's pretty easy. You can just back up that virtual machine. You know your application's installed, and then you know what makes up that application, say in like a 3-tier web application. With containers and Kubernetes, we have all these different components. So being able to protect those components and build out a mapping of that so we can actually recover those. When we look at recoverability from a best practice perspective, being able to actually protect and manage those and actually recover those individual components is critical. So from a best practices perspective, you need to make sure that you can build out an execution plan. Because if you think back to that previous slide where we had the secrets and configuration maps and persistent storage, etc., you may just want to recover one of those individual components rather than restoring the whole application. Because remember, the application may have something like 106 pods in it. You maybe don't want to go and restore all those pods, just go and restore maybe a certificate. So having the ability to actually recover individual components and workload within those workloads is critical from a best practices perspective. From an operations perspective, when you look at integrating into these different platforms, and we look at how we integrate from not only a data services perspective, but also different Kubernetes offerings, you need to integrate from an operations perspective as well. So it's no good having a backup solution that goes and protects all your workloads if day two operations aren't able to integrate that into their daily processes. So understanding how these products and how you can integrate into your day two operations is critical. Does it work with the existing storage infrastructure? Because if the operations guys aren't comfortable with it, you're not going to have a successful backup solution. So as a best practice, make sure that the platforms you're deploying integrate not only from a native Kubernetes perspective, but they're also able to integrate with the Kubernetes distributions you're using, whether it be a managed services solution in the public cloud or an on-premises Kubernetes distribution. From a security perspective, we all talk about security. The Veeam Live keynote was all about security with the guy who used to work for FBI. You know, everything that we are doing and everything that's happening in the IT infrastructure in general is all about security. So best practices is to make sure that solutions integrate with your existing authentication. So things like integrating with identity access management, say if you're running in AWS, or integrating with your on-premises authentication solutions, making sure that you integrate from a role-based access control perspective as well, implementing the ability to give individual users different access to environments. So things like monitoring or common tasks like doing restores. Maybe you have different ops teams who manage that. And then of course, things like at-rest encryption as well. So when the data is stored, say in object storage, and you want to keep those backups for a certain number of months from a compliance perspective, making sure it's fully encrypted, whether it's in motion or at rest. Portability is one of my favorite aspects of Kubernetes. You know, when you think about the application that we showed in that first slide from an architecture perspective, having the ability to just wrap that and then move it around is very powerful. So from a portability best practice, are you able to restore the workloads to different platforms, different public cloud providers? You know, are you able to move from on-prem to the public cloud or vice versa? Are you able to clone those applications and are you able to migrate them? Portability, while a lot of people don't expect that to be a best practice, is critical to being able to implement a successful Kubernetes solution. So you can leverage the portability of the nature of containers and move across different Kubernetes distributions, those different availability zones, or even different storage systems. And that is a very common environment factor that we're finding out in the real world that a lot of customers are doing is developers are just moving these workloads around. So always consider portability a best practice, and does it implement not only into your operations processes and procedures, but also the environments that you're building. So I want to talk a little bit about Kasten, and I'm going to hand over to Vaibhav briefly. But Kasten, as you heard in the keynote from Bill and Danny, we recently acquired Kasten, who is the market leader for Kubernetes backup and recovery and disaster recovery. And the reason why Veeam acquired Kasten was we'd already integrated with them in a partnership manner, but the synergies between Veeam and Kasten is very strong. So When you hear about Veeam's use cases around supporting multiple workloads across multiple platforms, whether it be physical or virtual, bringing in Kasten also now allows us to protect those containerized applications, whether we're in those multiple environments. So from a Veeam perspective, you can protect your physical Windows, Linux VMs, you can protect your virtual machine VMs, whether it be vSphere, Hyper-V, Nutanix, you can protect your workloads, your instances out in AWS or Azure, and also your containerized apps running on any of those storage distributions. So the synergy between Veeam and Kasten is very strong, and it's very powerful as we move forwards. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Vaibhav, who's going to talk through some of the Kasten perspective and also give you a sneak peek into how things look integrating with Veeam. Over to you, Vaibhav. Thanks,
David. And hello, everyone, again. So as David mentioned, we've had a really strong partnership over the last year. And now as the Kubernetes division inside Veeam, I'm really excited to talk to you about how, given all those best practices that David just talked about, how we're actually going about addressing that and implementing that in our product. A little bit of background over here on the approach we've taken, right? So our focus was to make sure we build a software-only solution, which is really easy to use. You don't need to be a Kubernetes expert to implement all those best practices in your environment. And our focus really was, how do we solve these challenges for these new age cloud native applications with that kind of architecture that are being built in this environment. And there were a couple of two kind of tenets for us that we focused on, or we made sure we addressed. The first one being, we have to be very focused on those operational use cases. How do we make sure that just because we're using Kubernetes and we have applications that are really distributed, we don't lose track of these use cases, and we enable things like compliance management and everything being automated through policies and visibility across all your applications and data services running in this environment. But while doing that, what we want to make sure we're doing is making sure we're very dev friendly, making sure we don't restrict or we don't move away from why people are using these applications to start with. We want to make sure that any application that people want to build in this environment can be built, and we can still protect that. So that was really our focus. And what we've gone ahead and built is called the K10 product. And we'll see a demo of this in a second, including a sneak peek, as David mentioned, of a few new features. But really, it goes after, and these are the things it enables. It has that application discovery inbuilt so that you deploy us in the environment and things just get discovered automatically. Everything is automated through policies. We have a very simple, easy to use dashboard, as well as APIs. And then security is just baked into the product end to end. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. So let me actually switch to a recording of a demo I have, and we'll walk through that. And this will make some of these features and use cases a little bit more obvious. So let me switch to the demo over here. And as it starts to play, the first thing you'll see is this is our demo environment. So what I'm running over here is vSphere 7.0. I've got a couple of Kubernetes clusters deployed here using the Tanzu infrastructure that's now available. So you can see those VMs on the left. And since this is vSphere 7.0, it also has inbuilt what's called cloud native storage. So if you go over here, you'll see that vSphere now automatically discovers Kubernetes clusters and Kubernetes volumes running in those environments. And so you can see there are a whole bunch of those available here, and that becomes visible. If we switch to the command line for a second, what I do want to show you is from the command line, the Kubernetes cluster itself. So if we go look at the storage class, so this is a storage type being used in this environment, you'll see that it's the vSphere CSI driver. And that's what's being used to provision storage in this environment. And I've also got a couple of applications I want to show you. So the first one being a MySQL test application. So this is the application we're going to use to demo. The other application installed here, or the product installed here, is K10. So K10 is installed in the same cluster in that Kasten IO namespace. To install K10, it's very straightforward. So if you go to docs.kasten.io, you'll see over there all the different types of Kubernetes environments we support. So all the way things from managed services to things that are running on-prem. In this case, since it's a vSphere environment, all it takes to install in that environment is it's a single command line install. So you run this and we're installed inside that vSphere environment. So that's very easy. And so all our supported platforms are over here. When we're installed in environment, the first thing that's available to you is going to be the K10 dashboard. So if you go look at the dashboard over here, there are a few things that I want to show. First thing on the left being that applications view. So we've gone ahead and discovered that there are those 2 applications installed in this cluster. But it's not just how many applications there are. It is actually about building that mapping that we talked about. So we've gone ahead and actually gone and discovered what makes up these applications. What are the data components? What are the pods and the workloads? What do we need for networking? What do we need for configuration, certificates? All of that information is something that we automatically discover. And it's important to do this, A, because these applications are so distributed and it's really a black box. But also because things are changing so rapidly in this environment. Every time a deploy job runs, things change. The other thing I wanted to go ahead and show is how this K10 deployment has actually been configured. The first thing you'll see here is that we have an infrastructure, what we call an infrastructure profile. So we're connected to that vCenter environment. This allows us to discover all the data components and operate on those. And here's where you configure backup locations as well. So you can go ahead and configure your backup targets. And this is where you'll see that we now integrate natively with the Veeam backup server. So if you have a VBR environment, you can actually go ahead and connect Kasten to that, and Kasten will use that as a backup target. So let me go ahead and configure that over here. Just enter the target, figure out which repository you want to use, give us credentials for that location, and that's how you get things configured in this environment. Let's go and configure that. And that's really all it takes to now configure VBR as a target. All right. So the next thing I'd like to show you is, now that we have things configured, how do you set up that automation? And everything here is through policies. You create a policy, you set it up, and that's all you need to do to make sure everything is being protected. The system will kind of work to make sure whatever you've described happens. So I'm going to go ahead and create a demo policy in this environment and configure the first action I want this policy to take. So the first action is I want to take that really local snapshot of that MySQL application. Can configure whatever frequency I want. I'm going to say run every hour. And here, what I'm going to say is those local snapshots that are in VMware, let's only keep the last 5 over there. But what I want to do is, after taking a snapshot, I want to actually go ahead and export this to the backup repository I've configured. So in this case, I've configured VBR as the backup repository. So let me go ahead and configure every snapshot to be moved there. And I can actually control the retention schedule of those independently. So over here, I'm going to keep those backups for a longer time. I'm going to keep 24 hours, weeklies, and dailies. So that really is all it's needed to configure that operation. Once you've configured kind of your scheduling aspects, you want to say, you want to describe what this policy should map to. So you can either select a specific application, or you can actually use Kubernetes labels. You can say everything that matches a specific label, such as app MySQL or deployed using Helm, just apply that to them. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to configure what's called a wildcard policy. So I'm going to say everything that matches the prefix MySQL, any application that matches that, let this policy apply to that. We also have, after you configure that, options to whether you want to back up everything in the application or just certain components. Let's say you don't want to back up certificates or secrets. You can configure that over there. But that's really all it takes to set up that automation. And once this is set up, you're good to go. So one of the things you'll notice over here is this compliance view. And you would have noticed that the unmanaged applications changed, and now we have one application that's non-compliant. What that means is that we've got one application for which there's no policy. We've got an application for which there is a policy, which we just created, which is MySQL, but it hasn't run yet. And all of this information, the system continuously monitors any new applications coming in and can set up alerts. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to run that policy manually right now to show you what happens when it runs. So the first thing you'll notice is suddenly the compliance state has changed. It's now compliant. So if you had alerts built in, that alert would go away. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, what you'll notice is that a backup job has now been triggered. So the first thing it's going to do is take that local snapshot inside VMware. So that's completed. And if we go ahead and actually look at what's happened over there, it's right at the bottom of the screen. Hopefully it's visible. But if you go look at the details over here, you'll see that for volumes, we've gone ahead and taken local snapshots. We've also captured all the other resources, secrets, configuration, all of that information we had created a mapping for earlier. We've gone ahead and captured all of that, and that's now part of this snapshot that can be used to recover in the same environment. But meanwhile, what's happened is a second job got triggered. So you see that just complete now at the bottom of the screen. And what that did is, since we had configured every snapshot to be moved to that external backup repository, it's gone ahead and done that. And so if we go ahead and look at the details over there, you'll notice it's slightly different. We've gone ahead, it still includes all of the configuration that we talked about, but now we've actually got the data for one of those snapshots we had looked at earlier. The data has actually been moved into that target, which is VBR over here. And you're seeing something that we've just recently kind of started to build. So if I go and switch to my Veeam backup server and look at the repository over there, what you'll see is it is now aware of Kubernetes backups. It actually discovers that there was a MySQL application that had been backed up. If you go look at the restore points over there, you'll actually see that restore point that we just created and the data we actually just moved there. So VBR is actually aware of all of this. And what this opens up is all the things that you can do with restore points in your VBR infrastructure. Now suddenly you can do with Kubernetes backups as well. So this is really exciting for us. So that was really what I had in terms of demo. What we saw today really only scratched the surface in terms of the features we have in K10. We talked a lot about what happens with the data, where the backups are, where they get moved around. But we've also got a number of features, both focused on Kubernetes or cloud native specifics, things like auto discovery of applications, things like transformations, which is really interesting. David talked about portability. Portability is really key here. What you want to be able to do is take an application, back it up, and restore it in any environment. And often there are some specifics to infrastructure that need to be changed. And so the K10 platform has things like transforms built in, which can do that transformation automatically as you're moving between environments. So we have a number of features in there, and then specifically on the right side, really focused on those operational use cases, those day two use cases, to make sure there are no gaps in your data protection story. Back to you, David. That's all I had to cover.
Yeah, thanks, Vaibhav. How cool is that, seeing the integration of Kubernetes backups into Veeam backup and replication? As someone who's been using Veeam backup and replication for a long time, as we're seeing all the integration of all these different platforms, whether it be that virtualization layer or the public cloud or anything like that, leveraging Veeam backup and replication as that single pane of glass for your whole data management capabilities is becoming phenomenal, certainly from my perspective and what I'm seeing out in the industry now. So I want to quickly recap on kind of the 5 best practices that we talked about at the beginning of this session. The architecture, always think about how you're going to actually protect those workloads that you're deploying in a Kubernetes environment. Things have changed. Things aren't just we deploy one virtual machine and put one application in it and we just protect that virtual machine. Certificates, secrets, pods, configuration maps. These are all components that make up an application now in today's modern cloud native world. So not only thinking about the architecture, but the recoverability of those workloads as well. As I showed in the slides, being able to build out an execution plan around those and then being able to recover individual components rather than the whole application. How do you integrate with your ops teams? You know, day 2 operations is critical in an enterprise world. And when you're deploying Kubernetes at scale, you don't want to have the operations team scurrying around trying to understand what's going on in the real world when there's a ransomware attack or there's an outage of your critical applications. So that integration with your operations teams is one of the most critical best practices and one of the most critical components of deploying a successful backup solution, whether it be physical, virtual, or container-led. Integrating with the security of the platforms that you're actually deploying the workloads in. I mentioned AWS identity and access management, but that role-based access control as well goes hand in hand with your operations and security. And then finally, that portability. Both Vaibhav and I have talked about the benefits of portability, how it works, and being able to migrate across different platforms. Leveraging different platforms for disaster recovery as well is critical as a best practice for implementing Kubernetes and also backup solutions. Next slide, please, Vaibhav. So with that, we're going to go to Robert, who's on the phone, and hopefully he's going to give us some questions that have been coming in from the audience. Over to you, Robert.
Yeah, guys, appreciate that. We had a bunch of good questions come through. Got most of them answered in the Q&A box, but I had a couple that I think could use some discussion. First one being, what are the requirements for backing up to a Veeam repository from Kasten? Is there anything we can elaborate on there? I know it's not officially released yet, but any information we can give?
I'll let Vaibhav answer that. He's writing the code.
Yeah, so it's still early, so I don't think we have a lot of details there yet to give. We expect to have this sometime next year. We are really focused on that VMware use cases. So when you're running in a vSphere environment, those are the ones that you'll start to see first.
Perfect. And then the second one was, can we back up both master and slave nodes in Kubernetes with Kasten?
I'll take that. So yeah, so we really focus on, first off, if you look at Kubernetes and if you think about what the philosophy there is, it is really to let your infrastructure, the methodology is you want to make sure that you can bring your infrastructure up from scratch, right? So what you really don't want to do is that anything that is very specific to a node, things like VM IPs or anything, you don't want to back up any of that. So what we do with Kasten is we make sure that everything you need to bring up let's say you're in a Kubernetes environment, everything you need to bring up that environment from scratch, whether it be cluster-wide resources, which are in your API server, or you have application resources or configuration or data, we capture all of that. So short answer to that question is yes, but the way we think about it is not being able to recreate that exact environment from scratch or exact VM configuration, but how do you just bring back the whole environment? Let's say if you had a new Kubernetes cluster, or you actually wanted to bring this up in a cloud environment from an on-prem environment.
Awesome.
We have any more, Robert?
I think that was it for ones we wanted to at least address live. I think the master and slave node was a good conversation to talk about kind of the application abstraction from the hardware. But I think that was it for ones to address live.
Perfect. And now my control works. Good old live presentations. So with that, I'm going to say thank you from myself to all the attendees. There's going to be a break. Please come back, go join the next sessions that are up. You'll see them at the top of the Veeam Live agenda for all the live ones. I hope you really enjoyed this session. It's a really exciting time in the industry around all these different platforms with public cloud and Kubernetes. And it was a pleasure to talk with you as well, Vaibhav.
It was great. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much.